far as like, I like to use the term elevator pitch. If someone asks you, what is Bitcoin? Do you have like a boiled down one sentence summary of what it is, your own version?
In its simplest form, Bitcoin is the money of the internet. Once you understand that, the next step is to understand that it's more than that. It's the internet of money. And then it's even more than that as you keep digging. It's not a company. It's not an organization. It's a software system that runs in thousands of different computers simultaneously, where no one has direct control over it. It's a collaborative open system. And it provides a currency and a system of payment that exists entirely online.
Do you see anything happening in the near future that's going to sort of tip the scale and make this sort of like a widely known thing that everybody uses?
I think it's important to understand that it's already being used in some places and under some circumstances and for some applications, because this is a technology that solves very specific problems that not that many people have yet. And it offers a number of opportunities, and as it matures, that space expands. Whether or not the financial institutions start using it or not, that's a bit like asking which phone company will start supporting faxes over the internet. That's not the point. You know, which horse carriage manufacturer will start using automobiles to do rides around Central Park. This is a system that allows us to not have financial institutions. It deinstitutionalizes finance. Just like the internet deinstitutionalized news or media or entertainment. So it's like, which record company is going to use the internet as its main distribution? Well, kind of all of them, but that's irrelevant, because the whole point is that you don't need the record company when you have the internet. And in the same way, you don't need a financial institution to engage in the acts of finance. Finance becomes an application, just like media distribution becomes an application. There is no TV station company supporting what you're doing right now, because a TV station is no longer an institution. It's an app you run on your desktop. So if you think of Bitcoin as that, as an app you run on your desktop that makes you the banker, and then the question, when will bankers use this, doesn't really make sense, because they won't. In fact, this kills banking, at least traditional consumer banking, retail banking of the type of a checking account, a savings account, sending money from one friend to another. There's no need to do that any more than there's a need to print out a newspaper and distribute it in the era of the internet. So as for broad adoption, well, you know, at the moment, in the Western developed world, Bitcoin doesn't really solve a problem for someone. US dollars work, Visa cards work, and most people, and that's about 85% of the population, have access to these tools. The issue is there's 15% of the population, some 60 million people, in fact, here in the US who have no access to banking. And as you go around the world, that percentage increases further and further. There are some countries where 75% of the population have no access to any form of financial service. And then the really interesting thing is, what happens if, for them, it's not about access to banking, it's simply about putting an app on a very simple smartphone, and suddenly that person, no matter where they are, has the same level of access to financial services as a licensed broker-dealer on Wall Street. And that's where things get really interesting. It opens up the entire space of finance, democratizes it, and makes it available to anyone with access to a basic computing device and some basic data services anywhere on the planet, without vetting, without authorization, without middlemen, without any kind of controls and restrictions. And that really changes the way we see finance around the world.
So I guess my question is, what is the incentive for basically like an average, everyday work, blue collar person who has a 9-to-5 job or is self-employed, makes a decent amount of money, maybe invests in the stock market a little bit. What is the main incentive for somebody like that to get into Bitcoin or start investing into Bitcoin?
Well, if they're in the US and they have access to financial services, then really investment is correctly the only area that might have some interest to them.
What is the last thing you said? Sorry.
Investments might be the only area they have interest in.
Right.
If you think of someone who doesn't have access to those things, simply the ability to send money across borders to protect their wealth from inflation, those are other questions. But let's take a blue-collar worker in Pennsylvania who has access to a simple checking account, maybe even has a 401k. So the real question is, what can they do with this? The main thing they can do is have an alternative form of investment that does not behave like the other investments in their portfolio. So right now, all of their investments are all US dollar denominated in the American stock market, and they're all responding to the same kind of signals. So they're all very traditional, and they're all responding to the same signals, which nowadays is basically how much stimulus is the Federal Reserve doing? Lots? Great. Not so much? Not so good. And it doesn't really matter which company you pick, which stock you pick, which bond you pick, the entire economy is going to the song of the Federal Reserve. That's not a very robust system. It's a pretty fragile system, and it leads to these boom and bust cycles. And the US dollar loses value slowly, but through inflation, it loses value all of the time. So the thing about Bitcoin that's different is that while it is very volatile, it's not directly connected to these other things. So it behaves on its own tune. And so from that perspective, what I suggest is if someone's interested in investing in Bitcoin, they treat it like adding cayenne pepper to their stew. A pinch will make it a bit spicy and interesting. Put the whole pot of pepper into your stew, and you've ruined the stew. I hear a lot of people who are like, I'm going to take all of my 401k and stick it into Bitcoin. Well, that's probably not a smart first move. I would start small and maybe see how that goes, and as you gain experience. But I'm not primarily interested in Bitcoin for its investment potential. As an investment, it's a new technology. It's got some interesting characteristics. What's really interesting is about opening the world of finance to 6 billion people who have never had access. And connecting the world without barriers, without gatekeepers, without geopolitical games, without are you approved, vetted, documented, and politically correct enough to have access to this system. That is interesting. That is world-changing.
So what would you say it is that you do in the crypto world? What is your significance to the world of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and blockchain and all of that?
I'm the explainer.
Okay.
It's as simple as that. I try to take these complex topics and explain them in simple terms. The majority of my career in technology, I have been focusing on education and trying to explain complex topics in easy to understand terms. And I'm a computer scientist by training, so I'm a technical expert, but I try to speak the language of the non-technical expert. And that's what I do for Bitcoin and for open blockchains in general.
I believe it came out in 2008, Bitcoin did. Is that right?
The paper was released October 2008, October 31st, and the actual network started live January 3rd, 2009, yes.
Okay, so when this first came out, where were you and what made you decide to jump into this?
So I missed the first 2.5 years approximately of Bitcoin's life. I was interested in digital currencies and the application of cryptography to things like that since the early 1990s. But when Bitcoin came out, I didn't really pay attention to it, or I didn't hear about it. I seem to remember hearing about it sometime in 2011. and I dismissed it out of hand because what I read was about a gambling site. I wasn't particularly interested in gambling, so I made assumptions and ignored it. And then in 2012, I heard about it again. And this time, the article that I was reading had a link to the scientific white paper written by the inventor of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto. And I read that white paper and completely derailed my life, my career, and very, very derailed the next 4 months of my life as I devoured everything I could find about Bitcoin, all of the information I could find, and I spent 16, 18 hours a day reading, writing, and coding, and not eating or sleeping much. So that was a pretty good derailment.
Well, first of all, where did you find this so-called white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto?
So you can find it on the website bitcoin.org. And in PDF format as it was published October 2008. The article I was reading was on a geek news site called slashdot.org. It's an old style geek news media site. And it was about Bitcoin, but one of the links in the article was directly to the white paper. And so when I read this, keep in mind, I was primed to get it. I'd worked for 2 decades in information security and distributed systems and network protocols. And as I started reading, I was like, okay, this is not what I thought it was. This is not just a system of money. This is not just some kind of token thing. This is not a company. This is a very sophisticated, elegantly designed distributed system. And it seems to have solved one of the main problems in this field, which is how do you make it decentralized and prevent people from cheating? And that just blew my mind because I knew that a lot of people were working on that problem. So I was primed and it pushed all my buttons. And I had that epiphany moment.